it's almost never the first mistake that ruins you. But if you can never miss twice, the mistakes are just kind of a blip on the radar.
James Clear is the author of the New York Times bestseller Atomic Habits.
His work has been used by the teams in the NFL, NBA, and Fortune 500 companies.
Within 3 months of writing there, it was pretty obvious that this was the best idea that I had had so far. There are a lot of things in life that your family and your friends often want you to be safe, and you want to grow. It doesn't mean they don't love you or they don't want good things for you. It just is a difference in priorities. They want safety, you want growth. In a way, I almost feel like the bad days are more important than the good days.
If you want to be in that 1%, you can't do the same thing that 99% of other people are doing.
Every action you take is like a vote for the type of person you wish to become. No, doing one push-up does not transform your body, but it does cast a vote for I'm the type of person who doesn't miss workouts. Take a little bit of time to think about that. Who's the type of person I want to cast votes for? Two things come to mind, either fulfilling your potential. So, we are capable of so much, but it is so rare to have a moment where you are fully utilized. So fulfilling your potential seems like it qualifies. Related to that, not being your own bottleneck. We are, again, capable of so much, but talk ourselves out of so many opportunities, of so many achievements, attempts. In many ways, the hardest thing is not to keep winning, but to keep reaching, because you often talk yourself out of trying something else. So if you're not your own bottleneck, you're in a position to be, to fulfill your potential. So those are the two things that struck me first. Trade-offs, I guess. A lack of self-awareness, competing priorities. I think all these things play a factor. Not being clear about what you're optimizing for. It's not that no one's out there trying to make a poor decision. Nobody is trying to waste their time or be ineffective. I think it's just that life is dynamic, and what we were previously optimizing for may not be what we should be optimizing for in the moment. Or maybe we've entered a new season of life and we're slow on the uptake. We kind of are still inheriting the inertia or the old habits that we've been following, and we haven't upgraded or improved our strategies yet. Maybe what we really want is a little bit different than what is socially accepted or what we would be praised for or what the people around us want. And so we're forced into this tension between choosing what we feel like we want internally and what we feel like we'll be praised and supported for. And in many cases, the desire to belong will overpower the desire to improve. And so this desire that we all have to bond and connect, to be a part of community, to fit in with our friends and family, sometimes that conflicts with fulfilling your potential or with achieving the greatest thing. And so it's really being forced into these trade-offs over and over again that makes it a continuous battle to try to return and refocus on what matters most to you or clarify what is important in this season so that you can recommit to those habits and maybe shape your environment or your social groups in a way that supports it rather than hinders it. Complexity often is just like kind of a mask or a disguise. And, what we really want is actually pretty simple most of the time. But getting to the root of that, sifting away through all of the noise and finding the signal takes a lot of effort and a lot of work. I don't know that I have this figured out any better than anyone else. I struggle with all the same things everybody else struggles with. And that's why I write about the topics to begin with. My publisher said to me when I was working on Atomic Habits, we write the books we need. And, I definitely felt that way. I mean, do I procrastinate? Sure, all the time. Have I focused too much on the goal and not enough on the system? Yeah, absolutely. And so it's really, a lot of these messages are reminders to myself to refocus on the process or try to commit to building better habits, to get back on track quickly and not let one mistake become a dozen mistakes. So, I don't know that I have a good answer to how to live a life with clarity, but Some of the things that I try to do include not doing too many things. So if you're optimizing for too many things at once, it's very hard to remain clear. You just have you got too many, irons in the fire. There's too much going on. And so that is easy to do when you're choosing between a good use of time and a bad use of time. It becomes harder to do, and I think it becomes increasingly true as you get deeper and deeper into your career. It becomes harder to do when you're choosing between good uses of time and great uses of time. In a sense, the most dangerous things on your to-do list, the things that are most likely to remove clarity and cause confusion and introduce a sense of overwhelm, are items like 3 through 5 on your priority list, because you have a good story for why you're doing those things. That's why they're on the list to begin with. And smart people are so good at coming up with like valid excuses or developing stories that sound really reasonable. So you'll look at that list and you'll be like, oh, well, I need to do this. Like, this is number 3, like I have it on the list for a reason. This is a good way to spend time. I'll be productive. But the truth is items 3 through 5 are actually the greatest distraction to doing items 1 and 2, because you can convince yourself that you're being productive while still avoiding the highest leverage work. So not taking on too many projects, I think, is a really crucial part of it. Obviously, there's sort of a connecting point there, like a pre-step, which is you need to know what you're optimizing for. You need to know what is the most important thing. And that requires a little bit of self-reflection. It's a really good point. I think success has this quality where it tends to eat itself. You do something well, and because of that, new opportunities come your way. And if you just think about like each day has a certain amount of surface area where you live those 24 hours and things happen. Somebody comes up to the door and they knock on it, or people send messages to your inbox, or you receive something in the mail. It's very unlikely if you keep living days that you're not going to have distractions creep in. That's just kind of part of how the cycle of life works. And so you need to develop a system as that inbound increases for handling and filtering all of it. Sometimes it requires like a really extreme move. Like in my case, once the book took off, for the first couple years of my life, or first couple years of my business, I would answer every email that came in. Sometimes I was even sending emails. Like I was, if somebody signed up to the email list for the first like 10,000 subscribers, which was usually just, 50 a day or something like that, I would send emails out and say, hey, thanks so much for signing up. Like, really excited to have you here. And then you get over 10,000, you can't do that anymore. So then you just respond to the inbound that comes in. And then you get over 100,000 or 500,000 or whatever it is. And then you can't respond to the inbound anymore. So now the whole inbox is just shut off and it's just on an autoresponder. And I don't love that solution, but I needed an extreme filter like that, because otherwise there was no time left to write the next book or to do the thing that got people to come in the first place. So you kind of have to be continually upgrading your filter for what you say no to. And that's a really hard thing to learn, because sometimes things that like previously, 2 years ago, this opportunity would have been the most exciting thing to come across your desk all week. And now you have to say no to it. And so it's difficult to kind of learn that. So sometimes you can set a value to it. Sometimes I think you can use price or money as a filter. So for example, with speaking requests, I get 5-10 speaking requests a day. Obviously I can't do that many. So that is actually like a very weird part of my business, because we actually want 99% of requests to say no, just because I have time constraints. And so you just keep raising the price to use that as a filter. That's like one way to do it. But I don't think that money should always be the filter. It just kind of depends on what the area is. So another way I like to think about it is, what is the work that keeps working for me once it's done? So, I heard this phrase one time about email. It was this executive from Microsoft, and he said, email is where keystrokes go to die. And if you think about it, throughout the course of your life, you have a certain number of keystrokes. We all do. We don't know exactly what the number is, but there's some limited finite amounts of times that you're going to touch the keys. And the more that you spend those keystrokes on answering emails, the more you're spending those keystrokes on one individual person, or, maybe 2 or 3, but for the most part, it's just individual communication. But if you spend those same keystrokes on writing an article that gets posted to the blog, well, now 1 million people could potentially read it. And so that is a way of leveraging those keystrokes in a much more high leverage way. And that is also placing a value on the activity. It's not necessarily a monetary value. It's more thinking about leverage or scale or reach, but that's another way to do it. And then also that question that I just mentioned, what is the work that keeps working for me once it's done? Something like this is a good example. We record this interview, and after we're done, a year from now, somebody could listen to it. And this work, this time that I'm putting in right now, is still going to work for me even after this hour is complete. Compare that to, say, doing like a radio interview, which I used to do a couple of those when the book came out, but I tend to not do them anymore because as soon as that work is done, it vanishes. It's off the air. And so I'm trying to find ways to kind of like multiply my effort rather than to spend it once and then it's gone. And those are all different ways of filtering the requests or filtering time and placing different sorts of value on that time. But those are ways that maybe make it easier to say no to some of the things that you were previously saying yes to. It's probably still a little squishy and not like super clearly defined, but I would say it's trying to be useful. I try to maximize for reach rather than revenue. So I'm always trying to like impact the most number of people and not worry as much about the money side. If you do that well, then the money side usually tends to take care of itself. The person with the largest audience usually has a lot of opportunities for driving revenue. So it tends to work out fine. But that's kind of my general sense of mission is, can I create something useful? Can I try to be as useful to the broadest number of people possible? Now, there's a little bit of a personality thing associated with that, which is you could, like, for a long time, I thought about going to medical school. Not that the medical schools would have accepted me, but I thought about it. But a doctor makes a really meaningful difference in a smaller number of people's lives. So it's like a really high touch, but lower volume sort of thing. Whereas, like 10 million people have read Atomic Habits. I don't think anybody is under the impression that the book is making as big of a difference as like your doctor might make. So it's not as high touch. So it's a lower touch impact, but it's a much broader surface area. And I don't know that there's a right or wrong way. I'm not really trying to compare them. I mean, the world needs, many different types of people and many different types of services. But my point is the second style, kind of my personality gravitates towards that more and is interested in that. So it's kind of figuring out what you're particularly interested in. There is another thing I wanted to mention kind of connected to these last two questions and how you filter your time and thinking about sense of purpose and all that, which is a lot of the things that you're saying yes to, you may be saying yes to it because your ego is involved or because status is involved or because you're going to be praised for it in a certain way. And when you say, oh, it's hard for me to give that up, it maybe is just hard for you to give it up because you're like, you know what, I've already invested like 10 years of my career. And if I give this up, then like, that means all that time was kind of wasted, or like I lose a little bit of the status that I had in the industry. And sometimes that's required to continue to grow. The tighter that you cling to your current identity, the harder it becomes to grow beyond it. And some of the people that I admire the most, some of the entrepreneurs I've seen grow the most, some of my friends, they have this willingness to kind of walk back down the mountain a little bit and then maybe climb an adjacent peak. But that requires a lot of courage to walk back down for a little bit, to look foolish, to start something new, to maybe give up or release a little bit of the status that you had before so that you can try again and become a beginner over again. That requires a lot of courage, and people are a little scared of that, perhaps rightly so, but I think generally it's not as scary as you think it might be. And the ability to say no to some of those things that you feel like, oh, I have to do this. A lot of the time, the reason you feel like you have to do it is because of the story in your mind about the status that you have, or about the role that you occupy, or the position you want to cling on to. And if you're willing to release that a little bit, it becomes easier to focus on the new thing. The process of behavior change almost always starts with self-awareness. So, it's a conversation you have to have with yourself. And I also don't think that it's something that happens once. It's something that probably is a continual check-in. So having a process or a habit of reflection and review, whether that's once a week or whether it's once a year, whatever cadence makes sense for you, That can be really helpful. Basically, what we're just saying is, hey, you need some time to step back and think. And I've done this a couple different ways. One interesting thing I did about a year or two ago, I woke up each day and for 2 weeks, I opened a blank page of my notebook. And the first thing I did was I wrote at the top of the page, what am I really trying to achieve here? And it's surprising how much my answer changed over the course of 2 weeks. You would think after like 2 or 3 days, you'd be like just feeling kind of like a dummy and you're like, it's always just the same thing over and over again. But actually your answer changes a lot. You know, there were a lot of things that I wrote down early on that turns out that was just a middle step and it could have been cut out entirely. Or there were things that I wrote down that I thought I wanted, but actually if I gave it a little extra thought, it was like, well, actually that's something my parents want me to do. Well, I can't remember exactly what I wrote down because like I said, it was a year or two ago, but the general idea is that I was writing mostly about what do I want to achieve in my personal life? So what, I have young kids now, so we're in the middle of kind of building a family. So it was stuff focused around that. And then the second thing was, okay, I wrote this book, it's this bestseller. Now what am I going to do next? And, I kind of had to wrestle with that for a little bit because there's, on the one hand, you could just like chase whatever the book brings in. So you could say, okay, I'll do more speaking or I'll turn it into a consulting company and we'll have an Atomic Habits certification and all that kind of stuff. And there are a lot of other authors that do that kind of thing. And I'm not criticizing them at all. Like that may be the right choice for them. To me, that sounds like a nightmare because then I'm managing 50 consultants. I have like this huge team. I don't want to be a manager. I don't want to have a big team. And so if I was just writing down the obvious answer where it was like, oh, well, let me just grow revenue, then I end up living a lifestyle that I don't actually want. And man, you'd be surprised how often people are already making enough money to support their life, but then they choose to make more money, but live a worse daily life. And to me, that seems like a terrible trade, Now, of course, there's some threshold, like you got to take care of your needs. But if you're already at that threshold, to choose to make more money and live worse days seems like an awful trade. And so often we talk ourselves into doing that. I think that was something that helped me a little bit was that process of doing that for 2 weeks. And I realized, what I should start with, and this is a line from my buddy, John, who's one of my entrepreneurial friends. He says, the thing we start with is how do I want to live my days? And then inside that box, I can ask, how can I make the most money? Or how can I reach the most people? Or how can we do the most interesting thing? But only inside that box, not outside of it. And if you start with that, you end up with a very different set of answers than if you just start by asking, how can we make the most money? Or how can we reach the most people? Or how can we do the most interesting thing? And ideally, the objective here is to try to design a business, to design a lifestyle that you feel like serves you, rather than feeling like, you're chained to this thing that you created. So I like questions like that, questions that prompt self-reflection and get you to maybe think about it with, let's call them helpful constraints. And if you have those helpful constraints, you often come up with a very different answer, and I think often better answers. There's kind of a series of questions that I think you could use as a guidepost. So the first question we mentioned previously in the conversation, what am I optimizing for? So that's up to you to decide, but you got to be clear about it. It's very unlikely that you're going to just stumble your way into peak performance. You probably have to be at least somewhat clear about where you're going to spend your time and why. So what am I optimizing for? The second question is probably something along the lines of, can my current habits carry me to my desired future?
And how do we know that though?
Well, signals of progress is probably the short answer. Some form of feedback. So let me give you a couple different examples. When I started out my entrepreneurial career, I started a bunch of different websites over the first 2 years, just tried a couple different things, see if they work. I tried an iPhone app. I didn't create it. I paid a developer like $1,000 to make it. And all of those projects, let's say, or there were 4 or 5 different things over that 2-year span, they were okay, but they didn't really do a whole lot. They were fine, but I could tell like this wasn't the thing. And then, but I did hone my skills and I did learn how to build a website. And I was picking up some things, but nothing was really taking off. And then I started writing at jamesclear.com. This was about 2 years in to starting my entrepreneurial quest. And I had just been doing freelance gigs on the side to make money and make ends meet. And within 3 months of writing there, it was pretty obvious that this was the best idea that I had had so far. Email subscribers were coming faster. People were more engaged. It just was clicking better. And most things that go well, they tend to have at least early signals of progress. It's very unlikely that it just completely falls flat and then it's like, well, if you had just stuck with it, it's going to turn out to be something. You know, it may not be what you want right away, but you've got some signals that things are moving forward. So I think that's what you need to look for, are signals of progress. And that depends, differs depending on the thing that you're doing. If I take another example from my personal life, so I've been training in the gym for, probably 15 years now. And then before that, I was an athlete. And so I was loosely in the gym with the team and stuff like that. So I've been around the gym and weights for a long time. And, I think just the way that I got into it, my dad was kind of interested in Olympic lifting and some of my friends were kind of interested in powerlifting. So I did more of those movements when I got done with my athletic career. And it wasn't until like 3 years ago that I started doing more bodybuilding style stuff. And it took me a long time. It took me a decade before I stumbled into that, but my body just seems to respond better to that kind of training. And again, there were signals of progress. It was kind of obvious to me, if I step back after like 6 months of doing that, my body still felt really good. Whereas when I was training powerlifting style and Olympic lifting style, I would almost always get dinged up a little bit. Like every 6 months, I need to take a couple weeks off because my joints would hurt or something. But I don't know. I would always have some little interruption to my training. Whereas I've had a nice kind of 2 or 3 year streak now where I still feel pretty good. So, I guess the two things to kind of wrestle with there to think about: first, you need to know what you're optimizing for. But then secondly, you need to be willing to experiment a little bit and try new things. And as you're willing to do that, you're looking for these signals of progress. And eventually you're like, okay, this is a path that's a little more fruitful. So I think, what am I optimizing for? Can my current habits carry me to my desired future? Related to that, there's probably a little bit of like you're almost being ruthless with yourself about where you're actually spending your time. So one little thought experiment I like is, let's say aliens came down and they can't talk to you, but they can just watch you throughout the day. If somebody could see you, but they could only watch your actions and not hear your words, what would they say your priorities are? So you can't convince them. You can't tell them any stories. They can't be sold on your reasoning. They can only watch your behavior. And if you ask yourself questions like that, you start to realize like, oh, maybe I'm not, I say that I'm optimizing for one thing, but actually my behavior doesn't match up with that as well. And it's good to have a plan for how to change that, but just being aware of that, just noticing the gap between what you say you want and what you're doing, that alone, just noticing it, will often change your behavior a little bit. So, yeah, those are just a couple questions to ask. There's obviously kind of an endless cycle we could follow here. I mean, once you're a little bit more clear about what you're doing, what path you're on, then you can start asking questions like the ones that we raised earlier about, does this work keep working for me when it's done? Am I multiplying my efforts in a way that is productive rather than spending the keystrokes or spending the hour at one time and it's not serving me anymore? So you're kind of like, first, you're kind of like narrowing your focus and figuring out, am I on the right path? And then once you're on the path, you're trying to figure out, how can I move down it more quickly? How can I multiply the effort and the minutes and the hours that I'm putting in, and so on? I probably lean more towards Seneca's style and approach. I think that being comfortable with challenge, being comfortable with struggle, seeking it out in pockets is a really good strategy. As you kind of go through life, we all get beat up by life a little bit. We all face challenges. And, like when my parents were my age, they had 3 young kids. My sister had cancer at the age of 3. And so they probably weren't trying to seek out struggle in that moment. Like life was giving them plenty to handle on their own. And that's fine. Like I don't think we need to try to act like we need to do more than that. Sometimes life just hands you a bad deck of cards and or deals you a bad hand, and you need to deal with it as it arises. But when life doesn't challenge you, I think it's great to challenge yourself, because you kind of hone that ability, you hone that strength to manage some of those more difficult times. Also, this idea that, and I know that you don't believe this, but just based on how you asked the question, that, oh, no, let me succeed and then I'll free myself from struggle. I think there's this Alan Watts quote where he says something like, the brightness of the stars is only visible because of the darkness of the space behind them. And so you actually need the contrast. Without the contrast, you don't notice how bright the stars are. And the same thing is true for the good feelings that you want to have in your life. The reason it feels really good to win a Super Bowl or to launch a best-selling book or to get through some period of difficult trial in your life is because you had to struggle so much or put so much effort in ahead of time to get there. It's because it's so hard to do that by doing it, you can feel proud of yourself. And it's the contrast between all those dark periods that came before and the triumph that you're feeling right now that gives you the feeling of elation. If there wasn't any dark period before it, then there would be no contrast there, and you probably would just feel like kind of neutral the way you do on most days. So in that way, you almost can't have success without struggle because they're just, they require each other to provide the necessary contrast. Now, again, with all of these things that we're talking about, there's so much about life where opposites are both true. It's not, should you train or should you rest? It's, well, you actually need both. And the question is, do I need to train right now or do I need to rest right now? The question is not, should you read or should you write? It's, well, actually reading and writing are both important. And do I need to be reading right now or should I write a little bit right now? And so it's really a question in most areas of life, not about what to do, but about what to emphasize in this moment. And I think that also is true when it comes to struggle and challenge. Sometimes struggle gets glamorized so much. We almost think like if you're the type of person who works really hard and you're very ambitious, you almost feel like it has to be a struggle, otherwise it's not worth it. There's like some kind of, there's a badge of honor to be worn if you're always like struggling so much. Look at how hard I'm working. Look at how much I'm suffering. And so that must mean that I have value. I don't think it has to be like that either. There are going to be moments like that for everybody. And when you need to step up and have that kind of mindset, you better be ready for it and not scared of it. But that doesn't mean that you need to live your life in a state of perpetual struggle, in a state of perpetual suffering. There's nothing wrong with having peace and contentment. There's nothing wrong with stepping back and relaxing for a little bit. And in fact, it's probably the balance between the two and emphasizing them at different times that allows you to perform at an even higher level. So it's not a question of either or, it's both and, but it's just when.